Thank you, Father Simon, for this presentation and for your invitation to take part in this conference in the last talk before the rest of Israel, which is here. So, one of the sentences more often repeated by Pope Francis is properly this: we are all sinners. And when he tries to explain this reality, he says, our humanity is wounded. This is the consequence of original sin. The story of Adam and Eve, the rebellion against God described in the book of Genesis, uses a richly imaginative language to explain something that actually happened at the origins of mankind. So his explanation is completely traditional, and this is not the case what a lot of people think, also in the theological atmosphere, where it is said that today the idea of a single original couple, together with the idea that human history might be divided into two eras, pre and post-fall, seems completely absurd to many. As a result, some people has called for a dismantling of the doctrine and others for its reformulation. So it seems that the time has come to free ourselves from the burden that Augustine, in the furor of Pelagian controversy, has carried on our backs. But as Voltaire said, he was a warm and romantic brain who passed his life in perpetual self-contradiction. So my compatriot and Capuchin father, whose name is Alejandro de Villalmonte, after 25 years of studying original sin, he has concluded all his investigation publishing a book entitled Christianity Without Original Sin, where he says that already we have been created in grace, and so there is no a kind of guilt that is upon us. He says that the solution has already been initiated and is moving towards a satisfactory end. Well, unfortunately for him, I think that such a solution has not yet been reached, nor do I believe it will be reached in the future, because it is like putting aside 1,500 years of church teachings. Because as the Holy Bishop of Hippo specified against those who accused him of inventing the doctrine, he said that he had not invented anything because he had found it in the fathers, including Irenaeus. He quotes explicitly Irenaeus. But the point is that, according to him, original sin is well known as a fact, but most incomprehensive in mystery. Nil ad predicandum notius, nil ad intelligendum secretius. So others, not so exaggerated as my compatriot Villalmonte, have proposed to rename the doctrine and to search other names. And there is no success in this. Also because, as Leo Shepsik said, it happens also in scientific research that you can keep a terminology that perhaps doesn't correspond anymore to reality. The example he gives is the word atom. They use still this word, but the content of the word, so without parts, is no more acceptable. But still they use the word. So there is a third possible way of reinterpreting this doctrine, which is to try to shift the attention from Adam to Christ. And this is the Christocentric view that is more frequent in the theology in the last decades, especially also in Italian theology. I quote one of them who says, "The primacy of predestination in Christ certainly entails a dislocation of the theology of original sin from the perspective of originans to that of originatum." On this point, he says, there seems to be a consensus in current theology. Based on the rediscovery of the New Testament passages regarding the role of Christ in creation, this perspective maintains that between creation and incarnation, there is an intrinsic and essential link in God's current free historical plan, in virtue of which the Christological determination of man enters into the intrinsic component of his original constitution. By the way, I don't find easy to understand how one can integrate in the same sentence the expression intrinsic and essential link, which indicates necessity, with free historical plan, which denotes freedom. Anyway, the bibliography of recent decades suggests that there is a kind of gap between theology, one side, the magisterium of the church, the other side. Does a gap between theology and magisterium really exist? More generally, can there be room for the fall in a theology centered in Christ and not in sin, which wants to interpret Scripture in a credible way for today's man and interact with an evolutionary vision of the world? On the other hand, can be sustainable a theology of original sin, which professes as a principle, as I have read in the last fascicle of Hytrop, as a principle that there is no what without a how? In fact, revision, development are intrinsic to a tradition. We should not be surprised if some doctrines are reformulated. The point is that we will indeed have to determine whether reformulations violate the core or essential markers of the tradition, and we will have to concede that the determination of this is entrusted to the people of God. It seems that the historical nature of the fall is crucial to the doctrine, as well as the plot of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation constitutes the core plot of biblical faith. Any developments and proposals for extending the tradition will need to be accountable to this core in order to justify themselves as faithful extensions of the tradition. So we go to these new proposals in the 20th century. In a famous 1946 article, Jean Danielou praised Teilhard de Chardin's reflection on the cosmic Christ, but at the same time, he was critical of the understanding of the undervaluing of original sin in his thought. The Jesuit paleontologist had difficulties integrating the traditional doctrine of the fall into his evolutionary vision. The more we bring the past to life again by means of science, the less we can accommodate either Adam or the earthly paradise. The drama of Eden would be the very drama of the whole of human history, concentrated in a symbol profoundly expressive of reality. Adam and Eve are images of mankind pressing on towards God. In this new perspective, evil necessarily appears in the course of unification of the multiple, since it is precisely the expression of a state of plurality that is as yet incompletely organized. Applying this evolutionary conception to systematic theology, the doctrine of creation and sin takes on a dynamic sense, oriented toward the end, freeing it from a static conception too attentive to the beginnings. Gratuity is almost there, and is famous also his sentence: I believe that the universe is an evolution. I believe that evolution proceeds towards spirit. I believe that spirit in man is fully realized in a form of personality. I believe that the supremely personal is the universal Christ. To highlight the idea, I believe. So the idea that because of one man we have fallen into disgrace corresponds to a static view of the world. The unity of humans is not due to Adam, but to Christ, the culmination of creation, towards whom sinful man walks. Sinfulness is not a state in which we are born, but the desire to be creators without the Creator. In the following years, many authors were influenced by this approach. New proposals of interpreting original sin raised up. The words of Pius XII, as Father Marius said yesterday, about polygenism in Humani Generis, were understood as an invitation to theological deepening. As we have been said, Runner will move from the metaphysical necessity of monogenism to the possibility of and compatibility of polygenism with faith. Flick and Alsegi, who have devoted a huge research on the topic, will also change their vision, saying that the state of justice should be considered as virtual. That is to say, it could have been a step in the chain of evolution that nevertheless did not occur. Other authors will end up removing a singular value to the original originating sin, the originans, while new explanations, sociological, psychological, etc., will be given for the original originated sin, originatum. Schoenberg proposed, as has been said, the idea of the sin of the world that relativized the need for a reference to the first father. So it can be said that the theology of Adam has fallen. Indeed, some have decreed its death in the name of science. One could ask whether the how, in this case, has gone so far as to remove the what. Thierry Hambrecht, in his introduction to the publication of the book of La Bourtet, the Péché Originel, that publishes courses and articles in the 60s and 80s, in his introduction, he says that most of the theories emerged in recent decades eliminate the primitive historical act of a first sin, replacing it with a situation of sin common to humanity. This means, he says, moving from the causality of a first sin to the narrative of a common condition. This condition is in a certain way symbolic, sapiential, like a parable. Universal, certainly, but no longer causal. The problem lies in the difficulty of affirming a true transmission of original sin, since it is an inseparable parameter of our humanity. In wanting to distance ourselves from any concordism in relation to science, and above all from daring speculations on the origins, we run the risk, says Hambrecht, of falling from chance to necessity. The desire to situate original sin in the light of Christ the Redeemer and not in some obscure origins, an explanatory principle that goes without saying, does not change anything in the matter. As Aaron Riches puts it, every reduction of Adam, whether to Christology, to a metaphor, or an abstraction, is dubious on Christological grounds. It is not surprising that in summarizing the situation at the end of the 20th century, Wiedenhofer, a disciple of Ratzinger, described it as complex and confusing. But these are not the only ways in the last decades. There are other perspectives. In addition to dialogue with science, biblical exegesis has played an important role in these developments. The category of corporate personality has inspired various authors. In a study still widely cited, Jean de Frame, a Belgian Jesuit exegete, affirms that this notion is not merely a label, but has a realistic character. When many conceive of Adam and Eve as mythical, opposed to historical or real, the Belgian Jesuit affirms that the text of St. Paul, if we interpret it in the light of the concept of corporate personality, presupposes the true reality of the first as well as the second Adam. Some Christian thinkers continue to treat the doctrine of original sin according to a classical perspective. From the Catholic side, Romano Guardini speaks of the drama of sin in the framework of the parallelism between the first and the second Adam. The first fall, he says, though the fault of the first individual was the fault of all. And in his famous book, The Lord, he says a number of times that the failure of the Jewish people to accept Christ was the second fall, the import of which can be fully grasped only in connection with the first. In the same vein, Balthasar, after acknowledging with Scheven that original sin remains one of those mysteries of biblical revelation that can never be completely solved, explains, the fundamental assertion is this: a decision against God on the part of one individual, not any individual, but the one who founded the family of mankind, has plunged this whole family not into personal sin, but into a lack of grace. Labourdette has defended the historicity of the fall and the first Adam, following the framework traced by Gaston Fessard regarding a threefold division of history: natural, human, and supernatural. For him, both the state of original justice and the fall are contingent facts which entirely escape the sciences of nature, as their traces could be only historical, knowable only by revelation. They are theological facts whose substance, as we learned it from St. Thomas, is perfectly solid and cannot be doubted. Science has no more means of denying them than it has of denying the resurrection of Lazarus, he says. The unity of a first couple, which would correspond to the narrative of chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis, is for science an imported problem. It is first and foremost theological. It is, I think today, a false problem. And there is nothing more irritating than false problems. From a Reformed perspective, there are studies that maintain the coherence of the traditional doctrine. Henri Blocher considers essential and indisputable the fact that the affirmation of the disobedience in Eden as a real event or occurrence at a specific moment in time has been part of church dogma from the start. This author tries to show that the theory of evolution, when it is not expanded to philosophical dimensions, does not raise insuperable objections from the point of view of evangelical theology. The theory of evolution should not be imposed as a dogma, he says. Without claiming to defend what he calls a mere Adam of the gaps, he points out that there are enough gaps in the evidence to render unwise any assertion that our science leaves no place for Eden. A flexible and unexaggerated approach to the literary genre of the early chapters of Genesis allows Adam to fit in as the first theological man. Along these lines, taking into account a liturgical point of view common to Catholics and Orthodox Christians, it has been argued recently that medieval Latin Christians popularly celebrated the feast of Adam and Eve on December 24, and to this day, Orthodox Christians celebrate Adam and Eve on the Sunday before Christmas, when they celebrate the ancestors of Christ going back to Adam. Well, an idea cannot have a feast day. How has contemporary magisterium dealt with this question? With language adapted to the circumstances, the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, linked the historicity of the first sin to our situation of sin, from which Christ has come to free us. As a much commented text, Gaudium et Spes 22 teaches Christ, the final Adam, by the revelation of the mystery of the Father and his love, fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear. He who is the image of the invisible God is himself the perfect man. To the sons of Adam, he restores the divine likeness which had been disfigured from the first sin onward. Some years later, after the publication of the Dutch Catechism, which called into question these and other aspects of the church doctrine, Paul VI confessed in the Creed of the People of God the traditional doctrine of Trent. I don't repeat because it is very well known. John Paul II, on his part, in his numerous allocutions on original sin within his catechesis on the Creed, reaffirmed the doctrine traditionally held by the Church, going into detail on various aspects related to the teaching of the faith. In his catechesis and homilies, in one way or another, Pope Francis speaks of original sin in the classical sense, with reference to our first parents, Adam and Eve, in continuity with the 5 canons of the Decree of the Council of Trent, which represents the most complete ecclesial formulation of the dogma of original sin. Thus, the impression that theology and magisterium have taken divergent paths in recent decades seems to be confirmed. The question arises, is there someone who can somehow bring together theology and magisterium on this question? As a possible answer, it comes spontaneously to refer to the figure of a person who belongs to both sides, which is Joseph Ratzinger. And now I want to speak about his reflection on this topic. In a famous book, the Ratzinger Report, with Vittorio Messori in the mid-80s, Cardinal Ratzinger expressed his desire to devote himself to the theme of original sin in the future. If God frees me from my responsibilities in the future, I would like to write a book on original sin. Unfortunately, we don't have anymore that book because God didn't free him, but charged him more and more with the papacy and, So he said in this interview with Messori that the inability to understand original sin and to make it understandable is really one of the most difficult problems of present-day theology and pastoral ministry. His publications and lectures on this matter reveal a particular understanding which include an ontological, anthropological, and Christological perspective. And I want to enter into this question, into these 3 points. According to Ratzinger, in an evolutionist hypothesis of the world, which corresponds to a certain tailoredism in theology, there is obviously no place for an original sin. This, at most, is merely a symbolic, mythical expression to designate the natural deficiencies of a creature like man, who, from most imperfect origins, moves towards perfection. This, in his view, manifests a crisis of the sense of sin that goes beyond the discussion with sciences and arrives at the philosophical level. In this regard, he distinguishes between mystery and evident fact. The latter implies that a lucid, realistic view of man and of history cannot but stumble upon their alienation and discover that there is a rupture in relationships, in man's relationship to himself, to others, to God. Now, since man is preeminently a being in relationship, such a rupture reaches to the very roots and affects all else. Since we are unable to penetrate the reality and consequences of original sin, the mystery, precisely that such sin exists, is revealed to us. The derangement is ontological because it unbalances, confuses in us the logic of nature, thus preventing us from understanding how a fault at the origin of history can draw in its wake a situation of common sin. The trouble to find the relation between the sin of the origin and the state of sin in which we are born is precisely a manifestation of the transmitted sin. This is not just a phenomenological question, but something deeper, ontological. The inclination to evil is not original in man, as evil is not a kind of being, for being can indeed originate only from the wellspring of being, but a negative. It is rather a new law in us, concupiscence, which is opposed to the law given by the Creator. Sin as the true evil is not the work of God, but of the creature. Ratzinger thus sees in Christianity a dualism not of being, but of freedom and history, which is differently situated from that of the Greeks. It is personalistic, not ontological. Accordingly, it is necessary to move towards the anthropological perspective to analyze the sin of Adam and the transmission of original sin. In Ratzinger's dialogical conception of human being, the essence of original sin lies in the rupture of the constitutive relationship of dependence with God, from which the rest of our relationships depend. In the origin of sin, there is a lie that leads to a fatal confusion, since it supposes an erroneous image of God, as if God were the one without relationship. Sin is precisely the attempt to become self-sufficient, to sever every form of dependency, every instance of relationship. Sin implies also a mistaken idea of freedom that makes man think he would be able to overcome his limits, refusing being as a reality that precedes us and defines us in order to focus on freedom alone. Professor Ratzinger acknowledges both the individual and communal significance of Adam. It would be, he says this not in his publications, but in his lectures, the not written doctrines that sometimes are more interesting than the written ones. It would be false to understand Adam, the word and the story, just as a collective name for humankind. This is due, on the one hand, to his dialogical and relational anthropology that leads to discover that behind the faceless concepts of nature and supernatural, the concrete names of Adam and Christ are made visible. On the other hand, it is due to the valorization of the historicity of our being. History is not thought of as a collection of individuals, but rather it has its place in the tension between the first and the second Adam. This relational and the conception of sin is extended to the understanding of its transmission. And here we find the most original contribution of Ratzinger, which implies to overcome a merely physical understanding of the inheritance of sin, as we have spoken these days. Human nature, he says, does not fall to man's lot, so to speak, directly from God. Rather, it is warped and disfigured by a long human prehistory. Man has obtained for himself a second nature, the core of which is the susceptibility to egoism, concupiscence. This means that every human being enters into a world that is marked by relational damage. At the very moment that a person begins human existence, which is good, he or she is confronted by a sin-damaged world. Each of us enters into a situation in which relationality has been hurt. Accordingly, the traditional explanation regarding a propagation by nature can be opened towards a propagation by relation. The idea of sin as the rupture of relationships and the state of sin as inheritance of a damaged relationality is integrated in some way with the Augustinian and Thomist idea of a sin of nature. As for the topic monogenism versus polygenism, Ratzinger, not in his publications, but in his hidden doctrines, in his notes, in his lessons and lectures, spoke in his lectures, though not in his publications. In the 1964 Münster Notes, he holds an interesting distinction. The event of hominization in its internal depth is placed beyond the biological measures. That is to say, even when there is an extremely probable result that hominization has been originated inside a biological population in a polygenetic way, the possibility remains that the genial blitz of thinking on transcendence could happen for the first time in one or two individuals. Biological polygenism and theological monogenism are not then necessarily excluding antitheses, since the level of their questions does not completely overlap. Thereby, what belongs to the content of original sin, according to him, is that it goes back to a single origin, that it arises at us from the only beginning of humankind, from the only beginning constantly growing. It is essential that the first decision of humankind was characterized by a no. If this beginning was determined by one of more, this is not so important, he says. The sin of Adam and Eve would not necessarily imply affirming the existence of an exclusive single couple at the origin of humanity, nor a biological descent of all human beings from them. It would be enough to understand that someone was constituted by God as head along the lines of the biblical notion of corporative personality, which Ratzinger takes from Ephraim. Essential for our faith would not be the biological descent, but the first headship of Adam, from whom the destiny of humankind depends. And this leads to the Christological perspective. As soon as we speak of original sin as disrupted relationship, into whose distortions we find ourselves thirst, then we must always go on to say that God set to work at once to rebuild the relationship and to make it right. Since sin comes from the mistaken picture of God that man has produced, we can be saved only when he from whom we have cut ourselves off takes the initiative with us and stretches out his hand to us. Only God's love can purify damaged human love and radically reestablish the network of relationships. The creator of the first Adam has manifested himself as his Redeemer, becoming the second Adam, with whom mankind begins anew and finds itself once more. He who is by nature relationship and relationality reestablishes relationship as such. Christ has walked the opposite way of Adam. In Philippians 2 5 to 11, Paul rereads the Genesis story in the light of Christ. Not the grasping audacity of Prometheus, but the Son's obedience on the cross is the place where man's divinization is accomplished. Man can become God not by making himself God, but by allowing himself to be made son. The redemption wrought by the second Adam assumes the sin of the first together with its consequences, especially death, to destroy them. God breaks the old Adam collectively and individually so as to form the new Adam out of him. Thus, man can have access again in a mysterious way to the paradisiacal tree of life. And so we go to the conclusion that is a little bit long, but I think we have time. Ratzinger's thought points toward a realism that speaks about a first sin at the root of our state of sin. His criticism of a certain Taylorism unmasks the dualism between matter and spirit, good and evil, which is hidden behind that vision, and which in the end ontologizes evil rather than considering it as historical. In the Augustinian and Thomist tradition, evil is the absence of good, and therefore there is not a metaphysical evil, in contrast with what rationalism will later sustain. Idealism will consider it as belonging to the process of the Absolute's constitution. Properly understood, the Augustinian and Thomist view, they are not the same, but in this they are friends, obviously. The Augustinian and Thomist tradition view is Christocentric, not hamartiocentric, because the grace of Christ has primacy over the sin of Adam. The figure of Christ enlightens that of Adam. The Mysterium Pietatis sheds light on the Mysterium Iniquitatis. At the same time, Christ is the second Adam, and therefore the figure of the first parent, although secondary, is necessary. Otherwise, it would be difficult to understand why all of us are born in Adam, or why Christ's work is named by Paul recapitulation. Only in the mystery of the incarnate Word, says the Gaudium et Spes, does the mystery of man take on light. To the sons of Adam, he restores the divine likeness, which had been disfigured from the first sin onward. The Ratzingerian perspective fills in some of the gaps in those proposals that seek to explain original sin by simply shifting attention from Adam to Christ. At this point, I don't have here time to explain this, the influence of Karl Barth in Catholic theology should not be minimized, because his real concern is less to blur Adam's historical individuality than to make him thoroughly subordinate as to role and significance to the true first Adam, Jesus Christ. In a Catholic perspective, and Christian, Jesus Christ became incarnate for us men and for our salvation, as we say in the Creed. The mystery of the incarnation is seen by the Creed as part of the redemption. Christ, who is the second and last Adam, cannot be understood without taking into account the first Adam, that is, our human condition. As Leo Shepsik writes, it cannot be said that the doctrine of original sin must be founded renouncing its prior original factuality only on the meaning of Jesus Christ, which should be recognized in the first place. This would lead to a deviation from the historical salvific perspective. The doctrine of original sin must therefore be understood in the sense of Paul's Adam-Christ parallelism, in a way that is centered on Christ and finalized to him. So, at the end, must we reinterpret original sin? Yes, of course. We have done this the whole time in the history of the church. It has been said, and we cannot enter now. Is the final moments of the Congress. In the times of Augustine, the magisterium of the church went for the pessimistic view against the optimistic one. In the times of the Council of Trent, a reformulation took place because the church went for the optimistic and not for the pessimistic that was Luther. So obviously, the reinterpretation is always at stake because we are a tradition and we are a life body, and then reformulation comes by itself. So how can we reinterpret today original sin according to the view of Ratzinger and Benedict XVI? I think that a good way to propose this doctrine today is to say, as he said in his catechesis, the 3rd of December 2008, in the catechesis in the Pauline year, when he said that original sin is a mystery of darkness that is enveloped by two mysteries of light, which is the classical way to say that there is a first mystery of light, creation. There is a mystery of darkness that is introduced in history, sin, but history does not end here. There is a second mystery of light, which is that precisely because sin and evil is not ontologically original, but comes in history as the fruit of freedom, it can be healed. Because the drama of an radical evolutionistic view is that evil belongs to nature. If evil belongs to nature, it cannot be healed anymore. So it leads to a desperate vision of human being. But Christian view says, no, there is a second mystery of light, which is the mystery of Christ, who, as Ratzinger's Benedict XVI says, evil comes from a subordinate source. God with his light is stronger, and therefore evil can be overcome. Thus the creature man can be healed. Man is not only healable, but is healed de facto. God has introduced healing. He entered into history in person. He set a source of pure good against the permanent source of evil. The crucified and risen Christ, the new Adam, counters the murky river of evil with a river of light. Our conversation began with a quotation from Chesterton. Let's end with Chesterton. Not his book on Thomas Aquinas, but his book on St. Francis, with permission. And in that book, he said, "There are many who will smile at the saying, but it is profoundly true to say that the good news brought by the gospel was the news of original sin." At the end, as Pascal wrote in his Pensées, all faith consists in Jesus Christ and in Adam, and all morality in lust and in grace. This is the light that Christ the Redeemer offers to the mystery of evil and sin. And we finish with a quotation from Adolf Gesche. "May God live so that man may live." This is the meaning of Christian theology, which has never been able to separate the cause of God from the cause of man. Thank you.